Hello, a nice welcome to all for our discussion on the panel here. My name is Heinz Arnold. I'm editor of Markt und Technik, a weekly magazine in German language, as you may tell by my accent. And I'm proud to present here important members of the industry from different markets. And we will dive a little bit deeper into what happened and what may be the lessons from the severest shortage we have lived through in, I think, 30 years of semiconductor history. At least this is the period I can overview. And we will just start by introducing the panelists, and I will ask them to introduce themselves, and I will start here with Marco to my left.
Sure. Is it on? Okay. Hi, my name is Marco Metzger. I'm the COO and EVP of Neumonda. It's a highly specialized technology company for memory. I'm based in Taiwan, Taipei, since 5 years. And we also have a memory distribution business called Memphis Electronic. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Franco Linsky. I'm the Vice President EMEA for channel sales in ST Microelectronics. So ST Microelectronics, one of the leading semiconductor suppliers in Europe. I'm based in Munich, and we have a strong distribution network which is helping us serving the market in EMEA.
Georg Steinberger. I'm the chairman of the German Distribution Organization, and I'm also the president of the International Distribution Association.
My name is David Stein. I'm vice president of global supplier management at DigiKey Electronics. I'm responsible for the procurement aspect of DigiKey, the product management, and the sales management. And I've been with DigiKey for about 18 and a half years.
Okay. As I just mentioned, we experienced the severest shortage ever, and currently it seems like the market is divided in two parts. There is the consumer market, where we are entering downturn phase, as it seems, but there are industrial markets, automotive, where demand is still high. So what do you think, how will the market develop over the next month? Will the recession extend to the industry and automotive markets as well? Or will it be just concentrate on the consumer markets and PC markets, smartphones, gadgets like this? What is your feeling? What is your gut feeling? Marco, if you would like to start.
Sure. So I think what we have seen this year, you mentioned the consumer market like smartphones, PC, notebook. They had very good business the last 2 years. Before last year, basically, the demand dropped. So the expectation was normally it will continue to grow, the consumer market also last year. But because of the market, instead of 5% growing, it goes down 10%. There has been a lot of oversupply on specific products. So this is memory, these are specific foundry allocations, CPUs. But in reality, there still has been issues on industrial and automotive market. So there's one thing what is called the golden screw effect, right? So you have a product together you need to build, and one specific product is missing. And so because of this, the supply of all the other products cannot become in time. So what we see right now is kind of a balancing out the higher inventory levels, what companies have done in order to cope with this. And now they get suddenly this golden screw is better available. So the products are coming better in, and so they can digest the inventory which they have built up before. But everybody has built up inventory. So we are still in the process of an inventory digestion, which I would assume that it will still continue go through this year. But there will be some specific pockets which will be faster recovering, and others will be extend longer. in order to get your production full back up to speed.
What are the fastest markets going out of the downturn? What do you think?
Well, if we look at China at the moment, everybody is talking how the smartphone market is going down. So there have been some recent numbers after Chinese New Year where we see that demand is recovering or manufacturing is recovering. Very small, so we're talking about a very small level. But one thing is sure, it will not go further down this year. So this is sure. The market for smartphone will not go further down. So we are on a level where you can talk about, okay, how is it increasing? How it is basically going up. So for industrial market, I think we have not really seen a big downturn. I think it was quite stable, and I think if you think about electrification, you think about different application, there's a higher demand for semiconductor. So I would not address a specific segment, but one thing for sure, industrial and automotive and data center are the three segments where you have double-digit growth the next few years. Where, for example, smartphone, PC, notebook, you only have single-digit growth.
Georg, you have been working in the distribution area for decades. What is your feeling about how the market will develop from this point on?
So if we look at the last 2 years, we had really exceptional growth in distribution. In total, over 2 years, about 70% in value and about 50% in volume. So there were price increases, mainly driven from inflation, from energy prices, but also from manufacturers. But in fact, in 2 years, distribution delivered 50% more volume. And that volume, to some extent, is still sitting on the inventories of customers being built in products. And so I guess there's a slowdown in the ordering process at the moment. We have already taken in orders for 2023 last year, so the customers really booked in advance, and that is consumed at the moment. So I guess that we still see a record Q1, and then we will see a slowdown. But it could easily be that the slowdown in one market in Europe, in automotive and industrial, which are the main customers for us, are seeing a cut over with an increasing demand in the computer and communications business in Americas or in Asia. I think it will really be one cycle going down on the back of one other cycle going up. And as you know, it's two different markets from a technology perspective, but there's also some sort of overlap with many standard products, whether it's discrete or passive or mixed signal, analog, still used very heavily also in the computer side. So there will be ripple effects, definitely. So I guess by the end of the year, we see the computer market pick up, and we still work on the backlog from the last cycle.
And David, would you agree with what your colleague from the distribution had said?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think we've had explosive growth over the past 2 years, and definitely there's going to be an inventory correction, which we're feeling today. There's a product in distribution at the end customer, and but I would say that, to Marco's point, there's definitely other technologies or verticals that will drive the need for semiconductors over the next 2-3 quarters. I would include medical in there as well, which for Marco. And but I would say that we're going to start to see the market rebound probably end of Q3, early Q4, beginning of next year. So I'm not worried.
Okay, Frank, you are working for an IC manufacturer. Do you feel that sometimes as the scapegoat of the whole supply chain?
No, I think especially in Europe, we see a quite stable demand, which is mainly driven automotive, electrification, digitalization, and the same in the industrial market. So the demand is very strong, so we do not expect a major turn of the market. So the market for us looks very, very stable. The demand is still very strong, especially in those kind of vertical markets, which we cover mainly in EMEA. So automotive market, industrial market is the key, and there is a very stable demand, and the situation will not change dramatically the next quarters.
Okay. Maybe just one more thing to add, especially when you look at semiconductors. So if you think about, it took 60 years for semiconductors to go from 0 to 500 billion. And it will only take 10 years, the end of the decade, to go from 500 billion to 1 trillion. So this is said by many different independent researchers. So if we are looking forward, if you think about supply chains and thinking about how to cope with this market is growing, is very strong growing, and it's more, how to say this, in a more shorter time. So 60 years, 500 million or 500 billion, and 10 years to be 1 trillion to be achieved.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the demand is coming mainly currently from industrial automotive markets like that, driven by green industries and electrification in general, e-mobility, things like that. Do you think that this is really a sustainable demand? Will the predictions by the analysts at the end be right, that we face a really huge demand over the years to come? Or could you imagine that it's a little bit exaggerated and that the real markets are a little bit different from what is predicted? Georg?
Well, it always depends on who you believe. Market researchers and big consulting companies very often are paid for creating certain beliefs and certain narratives. And the automotive industry, specifically in Europe, has a big interest in everyone believing that self-driving car and autonomous driving and e-cars are the next big thing. But in fact, if you look at the market today, 70% is computer and communications, and that will not change. I think over time, it really depends if the consumers are buying the stories of the car industry, that there's an ever-growing demand for SUVs with all kinds of gadgets. If you think about your children generations, a lot of them don't want to have a car. And I think from a resource perspective, it would be much more, let's say, smart for a society to drive an economy with more shared resources. An electric car with 2.5 tons of iron driving around, that's complete nonsense from a sustainability perspective. And I think the growth rates of the automotive industry are built on that perception. If that changes, they will have a big problem, and will also change the forecasts on the semiconductors and so on. But think about the following. Self-driving cars and autonomous driving needs a lot of data center. So at the end, data center and computing will still be the driving force also from a technology and innovation perspective.
If you allow me one thing to add what Georg said, I think what is very important, today we are talking about roughly 85 million new cars a year, where 10% is EVs. So if we plan, and this is, I think, the trend in the market, that this percentage of the electric cars will increase during the next years, the content for semiconductor will be still increasing, because even in the smaller cars, if we don't talk about an SUV of 2.5 tons, even if you talk about smaller cars with an EV car, the digitalization will need a stronger content for ICs, exactly the same for the electrification, all the charging technology. So even if we move into this direction, the demand, especially in automotive, will continue to grow.
And you think that predictions are right, that the e-mobility will grow very rapidly? Or could you imagine that combustion engines will get a revival?
It's a very good question, but at the end I think everything, the path is set to move into the direction of increasing e-mobility. If you look in the different regions in the world, if you look especially to Asia, there is already a very, very strong trend to move towards the electromobility. And as well in Europe, we moved very quickly to 10% of the new built cars EV, and I think this will continue in this way.
I think since we are all working for the semiconductor industry, we hope all for high growth rates in electrification. Yeah, Dave?
I was going to add, I think what Frank said about regional differences is really important, because I think when you look at e-mobility, you need to have the infrastructure there to support the cars moving forward. And I think if you look across the world, different areas are at different places today, and that they have to catch up to be able to support that growth moving forward.
Okay. We are facing growing markets on the one hand. On the other hand, we have more competition between regions, the so-called deglobalization. USA, China, we all know what's going on. Fabs are going to be built in the US, in Europe, in Asia. A lot of money by governments is spent to attract companies who are earning a lot of money, get subsidies to build fabs all over the world. What do you think? Could this capacity, which is currently planned, trigger the next severe downturn?
There is, if you allow me, there is one thing which we should keep in mind. Between 2018 and 2020, there were 65 new semiconductor fabs started to build. Between 21 and 23, it's not even this amount. So the plans right now is in the range of 60 to 62. So the availability, the additional capacity is not going to speed up, to accelerate. We will add, at least in the next years, the same amount of capacity from a front-end point of view as we did as an industry the last 2 to 3 years. So there is no acceleration in the process of adding more capacity. So from this aspect, there is no expectation that the situation will change and will drive us in a downturn. There might be some short-term effects, but long-term, it will be very stable.
Okay, Georg?
That's a good point, because announced doesn't mean built. So there are a lot of numbers around how much money will be put into the semiconductor industry, but in fact, many of the investments are just announced and could be actually delayed. Yeah? The industry isn't stupid, so a new fab costs a lot of money, and you don't build just for the hope, but for a real demand. But what you see at the moment, very interesting, is that many big customers are driving actually the building of new capacity. In Germany, we have seen the announcement of Wolfspeed and ZF, so a tier 1 supplier for the car industry. And you may have seen in the top 10 semiconductor companies a company called Apple. So I'm seeing a return of the captive semiconductor company, what we had in the 80s and in the 90s, where IBM had its own semiconductor manufacturing, where Siemens had its own semiconductor manufacturing. Now we see Apple do the same. We may actually see Google, Amazon, and even Tesla invest in capacity just to secure their own supply and to develop their own, I would say, ICs, maybe together with some semiconductor manufacturers, maybe on their own, like Apple. So there will be a change in the structure of the industry that will also be very interesting to watch. But in general, I would say deglobalization, what we currently see, will cost more money. The semiconductor industry is very global and needs a global economies of scale in order to be profitable, in order to be effective. If that goes away, somebody has to pay the bill for the higher investment, and eventually will be the customer.
Guess who is going to pay? I know the answer at the end. We all are paying for it.
You already pay with your tax money.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately.
But it's a paradox. You pay tax money to help build factories that will produce more expensive chips. So you pay twice.
Yeah, I can remember I was on the Cornerstone event when AMD built the fab in Dresden. And I sit on the table with Jerry Sanders, and I said I wish him luck for the fab, and I hope it will be a good success. And he said, yeah, why I'm so interested? And I said, because I'm an owner of the fab. He said, what? You're not the owner of the fab. I'm a taxpayer in Germany, you know. I have at least a little part will be owned by myself. But anyway, what do you think are the huge subsidies really justified? For example, the subsidies here in Europe, it seems that the big companies are playing poker with the governments and want to get more and more money. Is that justified from your point of view, from your as an IC manufacturer, getting new competition into Europe, and from your point of view distribution, or from the memory point of view? So who wants to start? You?
Yeah, it's not for me to comment on industrial politics and things like that, but what we should keep in mind altogether is to build a fab is one thing, but to build a fab is not solving anything, because what is important is all the ecosystem around the fab, because building a fab means you need to create the R&D environment, the R&D ecosystem around. You need to invest in schools, in universities, to have the people available to staff those fabs. So it's easy to say we build a new fab, but just with building a new fab, it's not, the job is not done. It's much more around, the ecosystem around, and this will be the challenge for all the industry the next years.
It seems that everybody, or in the public believes that a new fab will solve all the problems. We have the back end as well, though this is very important, and this is concentrated in Asia, of course. And it will be very difficult to disentangle these elements of the supply chain. And then there are materials as well, which need to be the raw materials, and then you have to clean it and to build it to be available for the semiconductor industry. So I think in many discussions this factor is underestimated, and we are talking about self-sufficiency, and nobody really knows what they are talking about. So do you think that deglobalization is an option at least?
It's happening. It is happening, but let's say the US industry has a different, a different motivation than the European industry. If you think of intellectual property, about 40% or 50% of the intellectual property in the semiconductor industry is owned by American companies. So they have all reason to have fabs in the US to get it away from Asia, just to be on the safe side, geopolitically. No? The Europeans don't have that much intellectual property. We have successful companies like NXP or ST here or Infineon, but those are only a few players in a much bigger market where there are many more bigger players. And if you think about Qualcomm and Broadcom, those companies don't own a lot of fabs. They all build at TSMC, and that is a major driver. In Europe, we don't have that issue. So if somebody builds a fab here for foundry services, that's fine, but the foundry will be occupied by guys like him, by ST or by NXP, and not by end customers, or not too much by end customers, because they don't have semiconductor IP. They buy stuff that ST lets manufacture by TSMC in Taiwan, and maybe in the future in Europe or somewhere else. So the IP is the real issue. And here, I guess, is the longer-term problem of Europe. A fab doesn't change anything, but having IP, having people who think about IP is the major issue. And there, the game will be between the US and China, and not between Europe and the US and China. Forget it. So Europe has long missed the train on the most interesting parts of the industry, which is computing and communication. We are out of that almost.
The other thing I would add is deglobalization has been happening for years. And for different reasons in the past. You look at, natural disasters are occurring more today than they have in the past. I think suppliers that's on their mind to make sure that the products that they're building are being able to be built in different areas of the world to be able to service the customers in case of natural disasters occurring. And I would also say, going back to the last question, if you look at the fabs that have been built over the past 4, 5, 6 years, labor's been a big issue, and I don't think that was thought out well enough ahead of time, because to have the fab there is great, but to have the infrastructure and the labor to support it is another thing, and I think some suppliers are seeing the effects of that today.
Yeah, I think as you said, the shortage of skilled people is a big hurdle. Maybe it would be better to, or a suggestion to our government, to invest the money in education rather than new fabs. What do you think?
Huh. What's the German budget for the federal budget for education that they are announcing today? 1 billion euro. It's piecemeal compared to what's invested in the high-tech industry. So I guess you're right. There needs to be more investment. But how do you get people to study electronics? It's a hard thing to do. The way to your great idea that makes you a billionaire is very long and very stony. So how do we entice young people to really work in this industry that is so anonymous? You know, everyone has a mobile phone and says, piece of shit doesn't work, but it's a masterpiece of electronics. Nobody knows that anymore, unless it doesn't work, unless it functions. It doesn't function anymore. And I think we have to come away from that attitude that technology is available all the time. We have to develop it. We have to imagine the ideas that are bringing new markets. And Europe is rather, I'd say, rather niche-oriented on that. We have given up the computer industry. We have given up the smartphone industry. All the things that will drive the future development are not happening here. And that's a pity. That needs to be changed. And I'm not sure if any government here in Europe is up to that task. And if we want to compete in the semiconductor industry, we have to increase the European Chips Act from 50 billion to 500 billion. Then we are talking. And then maybe in a generation or so, if we really do everything right, we could eventually compete again with China and the US. But 25 years, not 10 years, as the European Commission announced.
Okay, speaking of education and learning and coming back to our industry, do you think that the participants in the supply chain learned anything about the last shortage? Is the relationship between IC manufacturers, foundries, distribution, EMS underwent any changes over the time? Did you experience that it became easier to talk to each other, to communicate? And are there any lessons which had been learned, or will we just keep on doing business as usual as it was before the crisis? What do you think?
Well, I would like to speak for ourselves. So as I mentioned before, so I work in the memory industry. And in memory industry, it's always very cyclical, right? So it's the nature of the business. So I think the last 2 years, when this has happened, we have been able to engage more with customers and better understand about their demand and the long-term supply. Because we are in an industrial segment where it's very important for the manufacturers to get the products in time. So when you look in consumer electronics, it's very much price-driven. So that's where you normally have the higher volumes. So if you're an industrial customer, you go to a manufacturer, sometimes it's difficult to get the attention. So because this business goes a lot via the distribution. So what we have seen is like that the customers working together with distributors, there's a more honest relationship than before. Before it's more like, okay, this time I win, I get a better price. And then next time when there's a shortage, then maybe the distributor wins. But now I think there's a better communication, at least, let's say, in the memory business, what I have seen and experienced.
Okay, I think it was a topic since I entered the industry some 30 years ago, where everybody said, we need more transparency. This was 30 years from now. I doubt a little bit that it will really take place from this.
Okay, now I give you one data point. This year, the capex in memory is reduced to almost 50% from previous year. It's the lowest capex since 7 years in memory history. So when we look when this has happened, it's almost you can put down a sure bet after 8 to 16 months is the next shortage. It's predictable. So you know this year, all the manufacturers basically reducing the capex. So it's natural, the demand is going up. So what is important for customer is kind of the supply. So if you have your normal production, you want to secure the supply. So you need to find new solutions that you get guaranteed the supply during this time. So I would say, thinking about semiconductor in this area, you need to define the different segments. Is it a CPU? Is it for automotive, for industrial? Another data point is also foundry. If you look at TSMC, only 5% of their revenue is automotive. So you mentioned before how we think about, or I think, Georg, you mentioned about Germany. We missed the train on computing, data center, all of this. But I think we have in Europe still a very good chance for the automotive industry. So if you look for some announcements, maybe TSMC will come for major nodes, 20 nanometers and above. But it doesn't help if they only come with a front-end fab. They need a back-end. And the only back-end we have in Europe right now is the former Qimonda or Nanium fab in Portugal, which is now owned by Amkor. So we need to look, in order to be able to make a more solid system in that we don't have these peaks anymore and that we don't need to talk about, okay, what has changed in the perception of customers, right? So we need this ecosystem to establish in Europe for these kind of industries where we are strong. And I believe automotive is still one of the industries, also for the electronic industry, where Europe is strong.
If you allow me one correction, there is a second back-end fab in Malta. We have a back-end fab in Malta.
For yourself only or for everybody?
Only for ourselves.
I mean for everybody.
Okay.
Because the new Intel fab is also only in Italy. They want to make a back-end.
So what I would like to add, there is a major learning out of this crisis. I think what is on the whole supply chain is understood in the meantime that a semiconductor, even if it's a few cent chip, is not a commodity. A semiconductor is a complex thing. It's a complex production. And the production for a semiconductor typically lasts 4 months, front end plus 4 weeks testing and finishing. To build a new fab in front end, from the starting of the building up to volume production lasts 4 years. So I think what is understood in the whole supply chain during the last crisis that we as a semiconductor supplier, we need very strong visibility about the demand of the customer. We need a very strong planning from the customers towards us to set the right planning in place to support the future demand of the customer. And this is something at least we see in the market as the major learning in this crisis. The understanding of the complexity of the semiconductor industry increased a lot in the last month.
Yeah, I know I was in talks with IC manufacturers and with the automotive industry, for example, and we had panel discussions within our publishing house. During the 90s, the IC manufacturers told exactly the same thing you told us here, and the automotive guys, they didn't want to hear it. They couldn't grasp, they could grasp it, they know it, but they didn't want to hear it, they didn't want to act like it. So what do you think, how could we get, in spite of this fact, a little bit more transparency into the supply chain? What can the distribution do for this?
I'll just say one thing that Frank mentioned about a 2-cent part versus a $40 part. I think what we've also learned is that a 2-cent part could put your line down as easy as a 40-cent part. What we saw a lot from our perspective was that customers were looking to have 2, 3, 4 vendors on their approved vendor list on the smaller and the commodity type products where they didn't have it before. So, and also trying to learn and understand from a supplier perspective who's actually making their own product and who has control over their supply chain versus who's buying other people's parts. So that gives them a little bit of a hedge. But overall, I think communication was enhanced, understanding from the distributor's perspective what the entire bill of material looks like that you're working with the customer, because if you're expediting a part and you know that that customer is not getting 2 other parts, you're almost spinning your wheels. So really understanding the customer, where they are with other products, and working on the expedites.
Okay. What is, unfortunately, I didn't succeed to persuade someone from the EMS industry to take part in this panel. What do you think? What is the role of the EMS industry?
I think it's a very important role because they have, let's say, great manufacturing capabilities, can make electronics manufacturing more efficient than maybe some OEMs themselves. That's the reason why it has been outsourced. But they also have to be sure to be paid for their business model and not trying to capture the profitability from the supply chain, because that sometimes will actually not work, specifically in times like the last 2 years. So if you're missing the golden screw, as you said, and the golden screw costs you $80, your board may be way beyond the actual price that you have calculated in the beginning. So cost of ownership is something that only happens outside of a single part price. It happens at the holistic view on your board and the partners you are able to create the board with. So the price of the single component should not be always the measurement for success in such companies. And maybe without finger pointing, the collaboration between distribution and EMS could eventually improve. And if we are able to create more transparency with the help of the manufacturers as well, and of some less Lopesianas in the OEMs, we could in fact create much better transparency and collaboration. Mm-hmm. So happy retirement, Mr. Lopez. That was what I wanted to say.
So this is a lesson which had been already learned, you think? This is a lesson which had been already learned?
No, the next rabbit hole is there, and everyone will jump down as soon as the market turns around, unfortunately. The next cycle will learn.
Maybe the next cycle.
The next cycle.
We hope for the next cycle. If you talk about costs, you mean mainly that the distribution costs, or
no, cost of ownership. You have a board. The costs are not just the cost of the components, but the cost of not having one component as well. So cost of ownership means controlling the entire supply chain for your specific solution. It's a cost of ownership is a well-known concept since the 60s, but nobody really thinks about it anymore. And I've mentioned it very often in articles in your magazine in the past, that I think personally that availability becomes more important than the actual components price.
Okay, I think for many companies during the last 2-3 years, brokers or independent distribution was the rescue, and they, as always during shortages, they earned a lot of money. And to whoever visited Electronica in Munich last year could tell by the size of their booths that they are doing very well. So what do you think, how is the relationship between distribution and brokers? It was not very friendly in the past. Is this changing a little bit?
I don't think so. It's hard to comment on the competition, quite frankly. I guess they serve a purpose. As a distributor, we buy franchise components from our suppliers. We don't buy from the gray market, our company. That's what our customers expect, to get products that are real. So it's hard to comment on on that part of the business.
Georg, what do you think? What is the difference, and is there anything which maybe independent distribution makes right at the present?
So, I've known brokers since I actually started in the industry in 1989, and they have always been around. And as David said, they served a great purpose in certain times. But what I've seen over the last 2 years is that the awareness of independent distributors and what they're able to offer has grown. It does not replace anything in the market, but it's very complementary to what you see. And I think as long as the pricing is fair and the service is transparent, is absolutely a good reason to have them around, to help in situations where it's difficult to get stuff outside of the limits of contracts and franchises. And many customers are using it, and many distributors are using it, and some suppliers are also using it, so it can't be that bad at the end of the day.
Okay, so I've heard that most of the things before the crisis will remain the same as after the crisis. Is that right? Would you agree?
Well, you know the old saying, before the crisis, no, after the crisis is before the crisis. So yeah, you'll see the next cycle coming, and we'll scratch our heads why it happened again. But well, it's almost natural.
Okay, so there are no lessons to learn for the industry.
Everything will become better, but you know, think about the industry. How many different components do we have? 100 million, 200 million different components around the world that customers put on boards. That is a complexity that will always lead to certain constraints. It's natural, so it will happen again. Yeah.
I think over the past 25, 30 years, we're in a cyclical industry. It goes up and it goes down. And I think this past 2.5, 3 years, my perspective, we definitely learned more this time than we did previous times. First of all, it was longer. There were other variables involved that we didn't have to deal with previously, and we had to deal with. So you can always learn, and I think based on what we've said over the past 10 minutes on this question, a lot was learned and can be carried forward to the next time.
Okay. Did you learn anything?
Yeah, for us, as I said before, I think the most important is that the final customer at the end understood that they need to be in control of the planning. In the past, before the crisis, they tended to give all the planning in the hand of the EMS, of the distributor. They understood for sure that the flexibility at a semiconductor supplier is limited, and that they need to be involved in the planning and in the demand planning from the beginning. And I think this will be the big change between before the crisis 3 years ago and now.
Okay, so what's your
I
opinion?
think for me the point is that because of all the buzz the last 2.5 years, more people get a better understanding of the semiconductor industry. More people understand how semiconductors are produced, where are the challenges in geopolitics. And to your point before, I really strongly believe that for the automotive industry, it was kind of a wake-up call when they find out they are basically, no matter if you are BMW, Mercedes or Volkswagen, TSMC doesn't care. So they don't get the allocation. I think this is probably something where especially German car manufacturers have learned the first time they need to adapt. So they hire now semiconductor specialists to cope more with these kind of things. And I think this overall will help in this segment to make better decisions or to be more fair. What you mentioned before, working together with manufacturers.
To complement what Frank has said and what Marco also mentioned, the supply chain cannot be owned just by the EMS and the distributors. So if the OEMs want to have more control, they also have to own part of that. And I mean that from a cost perspective. Just outsourcing all the problems and putting the inventory on the trucks with just in time is not good enough anymore. So in order to be responsible to themselves and their future supply and demand cycles, they have to own part of that supply chain. And that means paying a fair price for what's happening in the supply chain. I think that is the lesson that I think has been understood. I at least hope.
Okay, you all agree on the final words. I just want to ask the audience, are there any questions? If there are any questions, you have the chance to ask them here.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So I have individual questions for each one of you. So Marco, I love your content on LinkedIn, first of all. I follow them a lot. And my question was, you spoke about how now it's about consumption of the inventory. But I still see automotive companies struggling with the semiconductor demand. So where do you see this decoupling point? Because the automotive companies lost out because the capacity to the consumer tech, and now consumer tech is slowing down. So do you see the regaining of share? So just think about that. I'll move on to Frank. I have one question for you. You spoke about sustainable demand. One of your largest customers, Tesla, 2 weeks ago, recently announced they're cutting down their consumption of silicon carbide, which was a huge talk in electronica last year in power conversion devices. That is going to be the next change. But your biggest and your first adopter of silicon carbide just announced that they're going to reduce their demand by, like, the consumption by 75%. So how does that affect the whole dynamics and the automotive consumption? And finally, Jörg, I have a question for you as well. You spoke about deglobalization, and you spoke about how it's happening right now. But more than 60% of the silicon comes from China. More than 50% of the silicon carbide, silicon wafers come from South Korea. So how do you see this deglobalization happening in the semiconductor industry? And Herman, sorry, I don't have any questions for you, but you can pitch in with the answers. Thank you.
Okay, mine is pretty quick, right? When you talk about automotive, I think there's still, you have some of the phenomenon what I describe as the golden screw effect, right? So there are certain products in automotive which are not in high availability, right? Where you don't have this inventory correction, where the manufacturers need this and they cannot manufacture, let's say, like a full module to put in. So that's where you still have a lacking that they didn't get the attention and the supply for that.
So for my question, you're right. This is what one of our biggest customers for silicon carbide talked about a few days ago. They intend, it's not they will, they intend to reduce their silicon carbide content by 75%. As you can imagine, it was not a big surprise for us. We are working very close with our major partners. So we were aligned with this. This will not change the trend to silicon carbide at all. Yes, you're right. This was one of the first users of the silicon carbide technology, but there are many others around. There are many other car makers now moving into the silicon carbide technology. So our plan to move in this direction and to achieve the first $1 billion this year with silicon carbide is not changed at all.
And Jörg? Deglobalization.
Does it include gallium nitride as well, or are we seeing here a new trend that will replace silicon carbide?
Gallium nitride will be the next technology coming.
Okay, deglobalization. It actually, if you spell it out and explain it, what it is isolating China, People's Republic of China, from the rest of the technology supply chain. It's not a deglobalization as such that America does its own thing, Europe does its own thing. So there will be a lot of collaboration where the current trend is to try to cut China out. And if you say 60% of the silicon is coming from China, you probably mean that little island that some people call Taiwan to a large extent, right? So as you see, a lot of the manufacturing capacity is moving elsewhere, and I think that trend will continue, right? So how do we do without that? I don't know. We just hope that Mr. I've forgotten his name, the guy with the third term is waiting long enough to have TSMC open its fabs all around the world before he thinks about geopolitical games. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, so you mean just isolation of China, not deglobalization as the term which it suggests.
So South Korea is part of the global supply chain, we'll say, because it's, I will call it part of the Western world. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay, I don't see any question anymore, so thank you very much for your discussion here. I hope it was informative for you as well, and you could learn a few lessons for yourself and take it home. Thank you very much again, and have a nice show. Enjoy Nuremberg. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.